Washington, D.C., March 1941. On the U.S. Senate floor, legislators vote on a controversial bill, the Lend-Lease Act. It would provide American weapons to British soldiers fighting the Germans. The U.S. has yet to join World War II, and the bill's a hard sell. Senator Arthur Vandenberg stands up. Everyone holds their breath. He's one of the bill's most vocal opponents, known for preaching isolationism. But Vandenberg speaks in favor of the bill, completely reversing his stance. The bill passes. No one can explain the shocking about-face, but it might have something to do with a pretty young journalist named Cynthia. Vandenberg's having an affair with her. What he doesn't know is that her name isn't Cynthia. It's Betty Thorpe, and she isn't a journalist. She's an MI6 agent. Her mission? Get this bill passed. But Betty's just one part of a confirmed conspiracy, a secret campaign to make the U.S. enter World War II. It involves forgery, fake news, and, according to some theories, secret help from the President of the United States. Welcome to Conspiracy Theories, a Spotify podcast. I'm Carter Roy. New episodes come out every Wednesday. Check out our episodes and more on our YouTube channel, Conspiracy Theories Podcast, and on Instagram @The Conspiracy Pod. And we would love to hear from you, so if you're listening on the Spotify app, swipe up and give us your thoughts. This episode contains discussions of violence. Consider this when deciding how and when you'll listen. Stay with us. Today, Americans are absolutely obsessed with British culture. All the way back to the Beatles, Harry Potter, Adele, David Beckham, James Bond. But that hasn't always been the case. International relations used to be much colder, and today's ties might be due in part to an MI6 psy-op. Let's go back in time to 1939. It's been nearly 200 years since the U.S. detached from Britain as a colonial empire, but their relationship still shows it. They're economic rivals. They're barely allies. So when Great Britain declares war on Germany, the U.S. stays out of it. Many Americans believe that during World War I, the Brits conspired to trick the U.S. into entering the war, possibly because the British intercepted and published the Zimmermann telegram, a German communication that caused national outrage, forcing the U.S. to join the war. Americans aren't going to let that happen again. In May 1940, a poll finds that only 7% of Americans believe the U.S. should declare war on Germany. But for the British, the war's growing existential.
The fall of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, France had given him more than 100 million slaves to work for him or starve. The preliminaries were over. It was time for the main event, the Battle of Britain.
In May 1940, the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, makes American aid a top priority. If the British want to keep their country, they need reinforcements now. Churchill anxiously lobbies the U.S. for military support. President Franklin Roosevelt says he personally supports the cause, but his hands are bound if the country and lawmakers do not. The U.S. won't be sending any men. So Churchill takes matters into his own hands. He promised the British people that they would never surrender, and he has no plans to. Okay, so how does a Brit change American minds? He starts with a Canadian, Bill Stevenson. Bill Stevenson is a former Canadian fighter pilot and war hero. After World War I, He moved to London to become a business investor, but he didn't give up his wartime mindset. To protect his business interests, Stevenson set up his own private spy network across Europe. He dubbed it the British Industrial Secret Service. Some people say he wanted MI6 to recruit him, and they did. In the summer of 1939, MI6 offered to fund and assist Stevenson in return for his organization's intel. This isn't a typical arrangement for the British government, but by the start of World War II, the Brits needed information on Nazi Germany, and Stevenson's network was already in place. By June 1940, Stevenson has secured his reputation as a loyal spy. So, under Churchill's direction, MI6 comes to him with a proposal. They want Stevenson to sail to the United States and get a meeting with the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. Now, obviously, most people can't just call up the FBI and get a meeting with its director. Not even MI6. After pushing for America to join the war, their senior U.S. officer was banned from communicating with most U.S. agencies. The metaphorical telephone line to American politics had been cut. Hence, calling in Stevenson, who opens up his Rolodex. Now, back in his 20s, Stevenson was an amateur boxing world champion, and he's kept friends from that chapter of his life, including former world boxing champion Gene Tunney. Tunney happens to be close friends with Hoover and personally sets up an intro. In April 1940, Stevenson arrives at Hoover's office in Washington, D.C. The two men talk for hours. That evening, Stevenson sends a telegram to MI6 saying Hoover gave, quote, assurances of goodwill. Shortly after, Hoover asks for Stevenson to be the personal liaison between the U.S. and England. Stevenson accepts and moves to New York City. The same week he officially moves, Paris falls to the Nazis. Everyone fears London will be next. So, wasting no time, Stevenson goes to work on the 35th floor of New York's Rockefeller Center. The office sign reads, British Passport Control Office. Stevenson's official new title is British Passport Control Officer, but it's actually secretly the local MI6 headquarters, and Stevenson's their new head of operations in the U.S. He has big plans. Within a year, he recruits a team of nearly 100 agents, journalists, secretaries, researchers, document forgers, and media experts. They all have the same job: covertly manipulate the U.S. into joining World War II. Obviously, it won't be easy. The higher-ups in London warned Stevenson that with the U.S. election just a few months away, the political climate has become increasingly suspicious and sensitive to propaganda. On top of that, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover doesn't want the American public to know MI6 is back in town. So even though MI6 fulfills their side of the arrangement and provides the FBI with intel, the work the two organizations can do together is limited. But Stevenson finds a loophole. At the time, the U.S. doesn't have an official centralized spy agency. The Army, Navy, and FBI all engage in espionage independently. Since they don't communicate, Stevenson realizes he can work other avenues besides the FBI. So Stevenson goes straight to the top. The President of the United States. I'm so impressed by this guy. I mean, if I thought, other avenues, I don't think I'd be like, I think I'll just go talk to the president. And it's not entirely clear exactly how he secures the meeting, but given President Roosevelt's pro-war stance, it likely didn't take much convincing. From there, Stevenson keeps his hands in the U.S. government. He hears a top U.S. military commander Bill Donovan, has an upcoming trip to London. So MI6 rolls out the red carpet. They essentially stage direct Donovan's entire trip. Donovan's put up in a fancy 5-star hotel, given personal tours of military bases, and has an entire team dedicated to making him feel valued in London. He gets an audience with every major British political figure, including King George VI and the Queen, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and the Director of Naval Intelligence. Sounds like my kind of vacation. Now, just days after Donovan returns to D.C., Stevenson ensures they cross paths. The two Bills become fast friends, eventually growing so close that people call them Big Bill and Little Bill. I mean, it's better than Stevenson could have hoped. And they have a lot in common. Both grew up with immigrant parents in poverty on the US-Canadian border, both eagerly volunteered for the First World War, and both became self-made millionaires. So they really do have a lot to connect over personally. Most importantly, however, they're two non-Brits who sympathize with the British cause. It's where Stevenson made his fortune, and it's where Donovan was recently treated with such kindness and generosity. In fact, Donovan confesses that prior to his trip, he'd been warned that the British can be difficult, secretive, and patronizing toward Americans. But from his experience, well, they were exactly the opposite. He's emotionally convinced that the British could win the war and that the U.S. should throw all their support behind them. Confident in Donovan's loyalty, Stevenson moves on to the next phase of his operation. Around this time, President Roosevelt is creating a brand new intelligence organization called the Office of the Coordinator of Information, or COI. It's the forerunner of the CIA. At his meetings with the president, Stevenson starts talking up his good pal, Bill Donovan. Before long, Donovan is head of the COI. Oh, fancy that. That worked out. He'll build the organization from scratch and be responsible for coordinating and launching all American intelligence efforts. I mean, I can't believe how well this is going for Stevenson. He couldn't have asked for his plan to unfold any better. He even writes, "That night, I took 5 instead of the usual 4 hours sleep." I mean, I'd do 10 if I was celebrating. And deservedly so for him. By the summer of 1941, Bill Stevenson has the sympathetic ear of the director of the FBI, the president of the United States, and the head of the forerunner of the CIA. As MI6 begins manipulating the American public, the question becomes, how much did the U.S. government know? It's a muggy spring evening in 1941. The air is thick, like it might rain at any moment. A woman makes her way through a crowd of 15,000 demonstrators, mostly men, protesting on 8th Avenue in New York City. She carries a picket sign, urging the United States to join in the war. Thousands of protesters with similar banners and signs trail behind her. They're part of the Anti-Nazi League, or the ANL. As the woman weaves through the crowd, people boo and yell at her group. They've marched right into the thick of an America First protest, where thousands of isolationists gather. They're waiting to hear Charles Lindbergh, a famous pilot and pro-isolationist, speak. Someone shouts at the woman, "Get out of here or we'll kill you." But she refuses to turn back. One of the America First protesters breaks away from the crowd and charges the woman. He punches her in the face, knocking her to the ground. Mayhem breaks loose. Both sides tear into one another. Amid the screams and shouts, Lindbergh's voice plays over the loudspeaker.
France has now been defeated, and despite the propaganda and confusion of recent months, it is now obvious that England is losing the war. I believe and I have been forced to the conclusion that we cannot win this war for England regardless of how much assistance we send. That is why the America First Committee has been formed.
In short, he says Americans have to look out for Americans. But in America, it's a full-on riot. And photographers and journalists are there to capture it all. The next morning, papers everywhere report the violence at the America First rally. Interviews with A&L members describe the brutal attacks they experienced at the hands of the isolationist and right-wing demonstrators. Interestingly, the A&L members all have very similar talking points, as though they'd been coached. Because they were. This entire violent clash was orchestrated by British intelligence. Once MI6 had their tenterhooks in the federal government, they targeted activist groups. These groups, like the Anti-Nazi League, were already operating independently, trying to get the US to enter the war. But as we mentioned earlier, that wasn't a popular stance. These groups weren't making inroads. Until MI6 sent in Joseph Hirschberg. Hirschberg was a war refugee himself, an Orthodox Jew. He fled Antwerp just before the Germans invaded and quickly volunteered with British Special Operations. Thanks to his ultra-religious appearance, it was easy for Hirschberg to become a trusted member of the A&L. Still, members must have been surprised when Hirschberg proposed that the group's budget include $118,000 in funding from other sources, believed to be MI6. Now, they're not exactly paid crisis actors, since these are all people who willingly demonstrated for the cause, but they're not far off either. MI6 effectively bought the A&L. Then they mobilized it, sending A&L protesters into the America First rally with signs and talking points. This was a high-profile opportunity to co-opt the media coverage and portray the isolationists as a dangerous and volatile group. And it worked. The story ran everywhere. By mid-1941, Stevenson is running what historians consider to be the largest undercover foreign intelligence station ever established in the US. And he's only been in the country for a year. I'd say he's doing pretty well. The propaganda team is so large, they have to open their own office. Cover name, British and Overseas Features. Not to the State Department, it's a harmless news agency. But in reality, it's a fake news agency with nearly 1,000 employees. The team distributes 20-plus falsified stories a day in newspapers, magazines, and on the radio, all in the name of manipulating the American people. And the media are in on the conspiracy. Major publications, including the New York Times and the Baltimore Sun, knowingly run fake stories. Now, some want America to go to war. Others are on MI6's payroll, receiving a monthly stipend to publish stories. And news outlets that don't actively collaborate are fed fake tips by politicians, academics, and the official British press service. And stories that don't make it into the media become rumors. MI6 agents share gossip in nightclubs, airports, hostels, and amongst dock workers. No news is safe. One day, it's the New York Post claiming typhoid epidemic reported raging behind Nazi lines. Then the Newark Ledger assures readers, wounded Germans on the Russian front are being left to die. Many commit suicide, and others are killed by their comrades to spare them from slow death. And the New York Herald boasted that a delegate poll says 60% favor help for allies, showing a poll of answers invented by MI6 agents. Other stories report the Germans are running out of men, that Nazi generals are spying on behalf of the Soviets and planning to assassinate Hitler. that the Sicilian mafia is taking on the fascists, that British soldiers parachuted into Nazi-occupied France and took 40 prisoners of war without losing a single soldier. None of these reports are true. But after a year, it's clear fake news stories won't draw the US into war. They need something bigger. Something like the Zimmerman telegram. We mentioned it earlier. It's the uncovered German message that pushed America over the edge into joining World War I. To get the US to join this war, MI6 needs a new Zimmerman telegram. So they set out to find it, or create it. Sometime in 1941, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover approaches Stevenson for help. The White House has heard whispers that the Nazis might be planning to invade Bolivia. But Latin America is beyond the FBI's jurisdiction, so Hoover asks Stevenson to look into it. Stevenson sends one of his best and brightest young spies, 33-year-old Montgomery Hyde, to the Bolivian capital of La Paz. He's got the perfect name for a spy. Despite thorough digging, Hyde doesn't find any evidence of any planned Nazi invasions. But being an ambitious and quick-thinking agent, he asks one of his Bolivian contacts what a German coup would theoretically look like. The contact suggests it would start with a senior Bolivian diplomat in Germany, like Major Elias Belmonte Pabon, who's notoriously pro-Nazi. Well, what would he do? He'd likely send plans for the coup to co-conspirators in La Paz, masking it in an official sealed diplomatic bag. That's all Hyde needs to hear. He flies back to New York and pitches Stevenson his idea. What if we fabricate a letter from Belmonte plotting to facilitate a Nazi coup and make sure it's discovered by the right people? Now, this is beyond risky. But by mid-1941, German tanks are rolling into the Soviet Union. London is scarred by 9 months of bombs, and evacuated children are still separated from their families. This forgery could change the course of the war in the nick of time. Then they consider public opinion. A poll at that time asks Americans if a European invasion of Latin America would justify a U.S. declaration of war. 81% of Americans say yes. They'd go to war over Latin America. In the end, Stevenson agrees with Hyde. They set the plan in motion. First, Stevenson and Hyde acquire real letters sent by Belmonte so they can replicate his writing style and signature. With the help of expert forgers on their team, they're able to decipher the make and model of typewriter Belmonte uses. From there, the biggest obstacle is matching his signature. Oh, hey, luckily, Hyde's wife Dorothy also works on Stevenson's staff and runs the top-secret Room 99, the Department for Forgeries and Counterfeits. She helps mimic the Major's signature. And there they have it, the finished forgery. Then, late one evening in July, 2 of Stevenson's men walk across the Brooklyn Bridge and hurl the typewriter into the East River, discarding the evidence. Soon after, Stevenson tells J. Edgar Hoover that he did the digging Hoover requested, and he has major news about Bolivia. A German courier named Fritz will be traveling through Brazil into Bolivia, carrying documents related to a rumored Nazi coup. Stevenson says one of his agents will intercept the courier and retrieve the documents. Days later, the forged letter is in J. Edgar Hoover's possession, and he believes in its authenticity wholeheartedly. Within hours, it's on President Roosevelt's desk. From there, Hundreds of American newspapers report on the letter. And just when Stevenson thinks they've done it, President Roosevelt announces that he has no plans to make any executive orders following the discovery of the letter. It's a huge shock to both MI6 and the American people. They thought it would work, and it didn't. But MI6 has another forgery in mind. It's an extensive map of South and Central America, with each country's borders totally redrawn. Uruguay has been removed altogether. It outlines one massive German colony with 4 vassal states. I mean, look at this. The map is convincing, too. It's made using the same ink that a Nazi official would have used. There are handwritten notations in the margins that could have been written by a German bureaucrat. It is even slightly crumpled and stained, as though it had traveled far and wide. MI6's best forgery yet, by far. Stevenson passes the map off to his friend Bill Donovan, the head of COI, and on October 21st, 1941, Donovan delivers the forgery to Roosevelt. The idea behind it is to make it seem like this map was swiped right off of Hitler's desk. It suggests the Germans' plan isn't just to take over Bolivia, but all of South and Central America, which would, of course, put Germany at the doorstep of America. Now, just a week after receiving the map, President Franklin Roosevelt gives perhaps his most provocative speech since the start of World War II. Hundreds of diplomats, politicians, and journalists gather to hear him speak. At a podium at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., he starts by saying, "The shooting has started, and history has recorded who fired the first shot. In the long run, however, all that will matter is who fired the last shot." It's a public about-face. On the campaign trail, Roosevelt proclaimed he'd only ever engage in war if it was self-defense. Though he supported joining the war privately, he hadn't made his true feelings public. Until now. Then he reveals the existence of the map, which he says is clear-cut evidence that Hitler has plans to reconstruct Latin America, and the U.S. will not stand for it. To the world, recovering this map appears to be a major intelligence coup. And that's the official line. When a journalist asks the president if it's possible the map could be a fake, Roosevelt claims it's impossible. He says it comes from a source which is undoubtedly reliable. There is no question about that. Okay. Now, does Roosevelt really believe that? That is the real question. Does Roosevelt call his source reliable because he truly believes that, or because he's complicit in lying to the American people? And if he's willing to lie about the map, would he also lie about Pearl Harbor? In October 1941, President Roosevelt's speech about the recovered German map revs up the U.S. public. It's evidence the Nazis are leaving Europe and plotting to invade South America. It's potential grounds for war. But as far as the Nazis know, they aren't planning to invade South America. Even the higher-ups are confused. So Nazi officials launch an internal investigation to determine if the map did come from their camp. They can't find any definitive answers, but they have their suspicions, namely MI6. Before long, the German Foreign Ministry responds directly to President Roosevelt's speech. They claim the map does not belong to the Third Reich, and it is almost certainly a forgery. It is Bill Stevenson's worst nightmare. Being called out publicly for the hoax, It won't take long for accusations of forgery to trickle back to him and his MI6 team at Rockefeller Center. Except, they don't. Wait, what? I'm sorry, how? Well, President Roosevelt calls the German accusation of forgery a scream. He says the Germans are lying to cover their backs. He doesn't take the accusation seriously. And to be fair, it would be another in a long list of German lies. Or at least, well, that's what he says on the record. Like we mentioned earlier, it's possible the president was in on the hoax. He personally thought the U.S. should enter the war. He'd taken Stevenson's advice before, and his administration allowed Stevenson to carry out MI6 operations in America unfettered for over a year. Now, of course, there's no way of knowing for sure, but there is the fact that this isn't exactly an isolated incident. In the previous month alone, the president has been alerted to at least 3 forgeries distributed by British intelligence with the intention of making the Americans think the Nazis were looking for a stronghold in Latin America. Then suddenly, a damning document arrives from Stevenson, a known MI6 conduit, and through Bill Donovan, Stevenson's close friend. It's clear President Roosevelt knows MI6's game, so why believe this one? It's a little hard to parse out, I think, exactly how much FDR would have known or not known. And I think that's part of what goes on when you're president. If you have this policy you want to enact, well, sometimes maybe you have to live in the gray area a little bit. Now, Donovan also may have known the map was fake when he handed it over. And maybe J. Edgar Hoover expected this when he asked Stevenson to investigate South America. A little something like, hey, go check it out down there, see what you find. Regardless of what Roosevelt, Donovan, and Hoover knew and when, MI6's work has pushed the U.S. right to the brink of war with Germany. In just 18 months, MI6 successfully spread fake news, infiltrated pressure groups, and won over the American people. And they did so relatively undetected. Bill Stevenson is so close to the finish line, waiting on Congress to act. And then, on December 7th, 1941, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. In a span of 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans die, mostly Navy personnel. The next day, the U.S. declares war on Japan. Within days, Japan's allies, Italy and Germany, declare war on the U.S. America and Germany are at war. But by now, the American people are on the president's side. A poll finds that 2/3 of Americans are willing to enter the war and fight the Nazis. MI6's mission is accomplished. After the war, Stevenson becomes the first foreigner to receive the U.S. Medal of Merit. Donovan pins it on him himself. If you're watching the video, the image on screen is from that ceremony. Stevenson also becomes one of Ian Fleming's inspirations for James Bond. So his legacy continues to influence Americans today. But did the campaign really stop at a forged map? Or did they go a step further? Longtime listeners may recall that the Pearl Harbor attack spawned its own set of conspiracy theories. A major theory is that the U.S. provoked Japan into attacking so they'd have an excuse to enter World War II. Is it possible that was partially due to Stevenson and MI6? Well, throughout 1940 and 1941, the U.S. and Japan were negotiating a trade deal. And normally, this is a sign of peaceful international relations. But there's evidence the negotiations were not in good faith. In mid-December 1941, the American ambassador to Japan wrote to the president. He said the Japanese would notice if the U.S. wasn't being genuine in trade negotiations. The president wrote back, noting that his main goal in Southeast Asia wasn't a trade deal. It was to help Great Britain win the war. Then there's his war secretary's diary. In one entry, cabinet member Henry Stevenson wrote that the president openly speculated about an incoming Japanese attack. Stevenson wrote, quote, "The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves." Now, when those pages became public during the Joint Committee on the Investigation of the Pearl Harbor attack in 1946, multiple people then and since questioned Stevenson's use of maneuver. They accused the president of provoking an attack, perhaps as part of a joint operation with MI6 to sway the American people into supporting a war. Even if there was no provocation, there are also claims that U.S. Navy intelligence officers found evidence of a planned Japanese attack, but when they reported it, nothing was done, and that office's records were destroyed. If that intelligence existed, it's not impossible that MI6 uncovered it too, and also did nothing. Because after the U.S. enters the war, Stevenson remains at Rockefeller Center, managing what dwindles to a skeleton crew. They organize the office records and turn them into a single-volume history book of the work they did, excluding many of the more scandalous parts. Stevenson has 20 copies of the book produced. Then he has all the paperwork destroyed. Now, those books are how we know a little about what we do know, like Betty Thorpe, the honeypot spy we talked about earlier in the episode, who helped change Vandenberg's vote. But all the paperwork that's destroyed, well, that has things we don't know. Clearly, Stevenson had something he didn't want us to see. And so though we don't know the extent fully of the secret campaign, it is a confirmed conspiracy. And these kinds of conspiracies are still being run today. On you. And you might have heard the accusations that Russia meddled in the 2016 presidential election. Since then, the Russian government has been found responsible for interfering. Well, they spread misinformation, manipulated the news media, paid influencers, and hacked sensitive correspondence, which they used to their advantage. It's said that the Chinese are trying to do the same thing right now in 2025. Just like the British in 1941, they're trying to manipulate the American people. It's happened before. It could happen again. So, take everything you read or hear with a grain of salt. Or you might suddenly find that your opinions are not your own. Thank you for listening to Conspiracy Theories. We're here with a new episode every Wednesday. Be sure to check us out on Instagram at The Conspiracy Pod. If you're watching on Spotify, swipe up and give us your thoughts. For more information on Britain's secret campaign in the U.S., amongst the many sources we used, we found Agents of Influence by Henry Hemming extremely helpful to our research. Until next time, remember, the truth isn't always the best story. And the official story isn't always the truth. This episode was written and researched by Sarah Tardif, edited by Maggie Admire, fact-checked by Sophie Kemp, engineered by Alex Button, and video edited and sound designed by Ryan Contra. I'm your host, Carter Roy.